Welcome, Sean O'Sullivan, professor at The Ohio State University.
Hi, sorry. Hi, how are you? Welcome. Thank you for grilling me.
Sean, so you have like really kind of interesting story, even just looking at your curriculum vita, right?
Mm,
Princeton, Bristol, right? Yale, OSU, Boston Globe. But I'm going to let you tell us how you see that journey, that origin story feeding into your interests in narrative and specifically in, what you've become, say, known for, your work in seriality and TV, and of course, seriality across different, you know, coming in and out of narrative and poetry and so on and so forth. So, what's
yeah.
your story, Sean?
What is my story? I'm glad you put Decalogue on there, one of my favorite TV shows ever. Yes, this question about narrative theory is interesting. I probably like a lot of people of my generation, in college, there were no classes on narrative theory that I knew about. Maybe some places there were. So I sort of found my way to it. I'd always been interested in narrative in various forms, and I think it's part of it. It's my interest in different kinds of narrative, context, and that's one of the things that drew me to theory. But one way that I think about it, you mentioned the Globe, and so I worked part as an intern, then as a kind of regular freelancer for the Boston Globe back in the 80s. And one of the things about being a sports writer that is really interesting was a couple different things. One is when you go cover a game, right? Most people who are reading the article know what happened in the game, right? So the question of the game itself being kind of story, right? How that unfolds in ways that is a kind of a shared story, right? Nobody knows what the story is going to be. The game, has different protagonists. But then afterwards, what you're writing about it is interesting because you're choosing parts of that story to emphasize, right? You're choosing how to think about that. And if you're writing, there's different kind of genres of sports writing. One is just the game story, right? Where your main job is to cover what happens. But even then, there's different ways of doing it. If you want to get sort of micro, there's things that's called running. I mean, the old days when there were, well, in some ways it's even more that the case now because of the sort of no deadline-ness of online. But there used to be several different editions. And so you'd write a story as the game was happening that was basically just the facts, right? And then you'd have redo that version for a later edition where you're kind of giving different aspects of that story, right? But aside from just the game story, there's also like a sidebar where you're writing one aspect of it. So just writing games, sports are inherently narrative or interesting that has a narrative dimension, but the very fact that sports writing makes you ask questions about, whose story are you focalizing, right? Who's what character or what events, right? The whole question of which things, I'll probably mention this later. One of the things I always talk about with students is that, any story can be told in any different way, many number of ways. And to think about a story that you get is a result of a number of choices people have made in telling that. And the narrative is a result of choices, right? And that is just incredibly visible to you or just available to you as a sports writer, especially when you have 45 minutes to write something, to think about, okay, what, not that it's the right version of the story, but what version of the story am I telling, and when am I deciding to tell this and tell that? So that kind of practical experience, because I have tiny little bit of filmmaking experience, no real fiction writing experience, but that sense of that immediacy of, again, not just telling a story, but telling a story to an audience that I know is interested in that story, not necessarily my version of it, right? And so that the way that, sports is the most irrelevant part of the newspaper, but it's one people are interested in, probably because I think of sort of an interest in narrative and interested in both, if you want to call it the macro events of a narrative, but also the side issues. And that's one of the pleasures of sports writing as well, to write about something that nobody else has thought about, right? And finding a kind of a side, narrative that isn't one of the major ones. So that's a bit of non-academic background, but I think it informs my work, not so much that I think about sports writing as such, but I think about those questions of whose perspective, whose angle, what the audience is, right? And so that's one way that I think about it in terms of literature, film, and TV. One of the reasons I'm interested in all those is that, I have a kind of non-focused brain. I've always been interested I changed my major many times in college. I've been interested in lots of different media and forms. And one of the things that drew me to narrative theory, and this again may come up later, is that, unlike, which is not a critique of other forms, but other kind of ways of thinking about that literature or English is divided as to do with period, right, or genre. And those are great, but obviously one of the things that narrative theory can bring is an ability to think across, right, periods and genres, which again can be critiqued as potentially being ahistorical, and there's good and bad to that. But I think that it, at its best, and to me, I feel like I tend to be Aristotelian rather than Platonic in a sense. I think I use tools of narrative theory as they're relevant to particular contexts rather than having a particular, methodology that I feel like, I'm sure there's certain methods that I use more than others, but I try to think, okay, what's going on here that I can think about? But the tools are ones that, as I say, at their most useful are ones that allow you to, like, hey, what's something going on in this movie that's not the same as what's going on in this comic strip or what's going on in this, 19th century novel, but as important. I always tell my students, media specificity is really important. You don't want to sacrifice that. You want to think about, comics and how it's operating in film. So it's not one or the other. But I think what narrative theory can do is to allow kind of conversations, right, or to see, right, what not that they're equivalents, but there's some way that they're thinking about similar kinds of questions about, I don't know, constituent supplementary events, right? What is the essential narrative parts of the narrative and what are not? How do you begin a story, right? And there's certain particular ways that, say, TV shows begin stories or episodes, right? That are different from other ones, but by thinking about them together, I think in ways that invite. I try not to sort of like force things together that I don't think have a conversation, but if you sort of notice things, and I think just because of the nature of my scattered or whatever you want to call it, mind, I'm interested in links or echoes or correspondences, whether it's across media or again, the Decalogue, which is on the screen here. That's a TV show that, to argue that it had any real influence on American TV is probably a stretch. I mean, it's a series by Dickens, a Polish filmmaker. Each story is 10 different, is a modern story that sort of speaks to one of the 10 commandments, and they all take place in the same apartment building in Warsaw. And so it's not as if anybody in Hollywood was sitting around watching this in 88, 89, 90 and was influenced by it. It had more influence probably in the film world. But the way it's thinking about, are stories individual or are stories connected, right? How do we think about what links, a big narrative object and what separates it? Those are questions that I think we're always thinking about in television. And so one of the majors in the Decalogue is not that of a kind of actual influence, say, on the Sopranos or things like that, but it's sort of flexible thinking about how we think about a big story world and how characters relate to each other, right? Or how an episode relates to a series, right? It's a really rich, and interesting series in that regard. So my interest in connecting it, so that's the same medium, say, as 21st century American television, but I'm interested in connecting that to it because I think, what here are different models or different contexts, for thinking about these very basic narrative questions, like, what is a story, or what is a collection of stories, who's telling a story, what information is left out. One of the things about Decalogue is often you don't know things, right? So how does a narrator or a narrative, right, deliberately withhold information, not so much because it's a payoff, because that positions us differently as viewers. So that's covering a lot. I don't know if that has any linearity to it at all.
Yeah, no, Sean, that's really interesting. I have a related question, which is, it's kind of obvious to lots of people to see how something like Great Expectations and its kind of cliffhanger moment, and then the kind of hinge and bridge into the next sort of sequence happens as a way of kind of influencing or informing, I don't know, Mad Men or The Sopranos. But can we do a reverse as well? Can we learn about sort of storytelling and how it's being shaped in television and, cable televisions, and then now platform streaming television, to understand maybe devices we might have missed in 19th century big novels that were published in serial form?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's really helpful about it, I should say that actually my dissertation in grad school was all about 19th century novel. I was interested in film before that, and afterwards, and TV was something I did later. So that was kind of my historical grounding. And one of the things that's important about that era is that there's lots of different models of serialization within it, right? And I think that's one thing that we can not that it's opaque otherwise, but I think thinking about the different models we are aware of now, as you say, whether it's the platform, how that matters. You have a whole season drop on Netflix or other platforms, or this the sense of the length of a season, right? Some shows, as you say, I'm more interested in the cliffhanger model than not. I just was teaching Orange is the New Black, the first season of that. It's a show that's very interested in a cliffhanger model, whereas you mentioned Mad Men before, very rarely does it do that. So, yeah, if you compare, even you mentioned Great Expectations, even with Dickens' career, right? That's a weekly serial, which is most of his books were monthlies, having to do with lots of context, and that's another important thing to think about. Seriality always brings up issues of the marketplace, the practicality of it. Whenever I teach television, I always say, for all the artistic things we're talking about, there's also budgets, right? And there are production models. And one of the interesting things about TV and film is art forms, so they're always about some negotiation between technology, the three hands, technology on one hand, production practicalities in the other, and then our artistic, aesthetic, narrative interest in the other. And a lot of those, not exactly the same way, but some of those are present in the 19th century as well. That serialization existed before Dickens, but Pickwick Papers, his first big novel, sort of created a boom for it. But Pickwick as a novel is very different from later Dickens, right? It's much more episodic, much less, about sort of telling multiple stories that converge. Or something like Middlemarch, right, which is a monthly and much bigger chunks, right? So the actual episodes, if you want to call them, at Middlemarch are very different from the episodes of either even a Dickens monthly like Bleak House or Our Mutual Friend. And even when you mentioned the thing about the cliffhanger, even within Dickens, it's interesting because sometimes you get episodes that have some kind of, shock value, whatever, and sometimes you don't, right? And then another model when I've taught serial classes involving sort of Victorian writers, another person I bring into the mix sometimes is Thomas Hardy, who was serialized against his will. He didn't write the book serially, but he wrote them. And then because of the popularity of the serial market, they were published serially. But sometimes if you read the actual segments in which a novel like Tess of D'Urberville's was published in, you're like, why is this stopping here, right? So that's an interesting example of how the marketplace expectations are so strong, right, that they sort of just cut up, right, the narrative, into those segments, whether the text wants it like that. Whereas someone like Dickens is the other extreme, where he's someone who's thinking very much about the segment, right? That's the first thing he's thinking about. And as you say, sometimes the segment has a certain kind of goal in mind in terms of storytelling, but sometimes it may not necessarily. I think the biggest cliffhanger in seriality is just the fact that it interrupts and comes back, right? Whether there's something inherently that brings you back, and obviously plenty of serials, especially like 1930s, movie serials like Flash Gordon, they're very much predicated on that model, right? And that's obviously a huge part of them. But it seems to me the very fact of interruption and return, right, is its own kind of, whether you call it cliffhanger, but that sense of the space that we're left in is a hugely important part of how people have responded to serials from the very beginning, or just how serials are defined as a form. And I think I don't want to go too long on this answer, but I think the very fact that people ask questions, right, about the fact now that, these 19th century novels are hardly anybody reads them serially anymore, right? So I think one of the big discussions in the field of seriality studies is, well, are things only serial as they're happening, right? Once they're done, do we think about them differently? And my feeling is, yeah, sure, it matters if we read Great Expectations in one evening, right? And sometimes the joins are less visible, depending what edition you read. You might not know where the breaks were. But it seems to me, partly because I'm interested in, right, these production conditions, if something is made under certain kind of processes, right, whether they're obviously visible. I think some of the things you work on in comics as well is interesting, right? Sometimes comics are published serially and they're collected at the end, and sometimes they're published as a single thing. And it doesn't mean there's one right way of doing it. That's something that's important to me of reading it, right? But if something made under certain kind of interruptive conditions, as you want to call it that, I think those can often be really illustrative of not just how the thing is made, but how we might respond to it, right? And I think that's one of the things I like about working on seriality is that, I don't have like a big beef about the whole issue of the ahistoricity of narrative theory, but I think working on serials, even if I'm not a reception historian, I'm not someone who necessarily foregrounds that explicitly, but I think the fact that you have to always be aware, right, of even just the time span under which something was published as some element of its existence in the world, that brings some combination of audience, the changeability. I mean, one thing about serials is that things may change in people's lives as they're writing it, right? So that thing may get incorporated. So the fact that it's a living, breathing object as it's made I sometimes use the analogy of a fresco, right? It's something that's made in a short period of time, and that whatever you get, right? Obviously, you can go back and revise it. So there are these things about the actual making, the things about the actual reception that are factors as much as, these sort of more, if you want to call them traditional or bedrock narrative theory things, which are internal, right, to the processes of the narrative object.
Sean, let me ask you then
Yeah,
just to push a little bit on this
sure.
idea of shaping the materiality or the reception.
Yeah.
So seriality obviously is an important shaper of narrative. It's in fact, in and of itself, a kind of shaping device, whether it's imposed after the fact or integrated in the creating. But what happens when it is only sort of used to satisfy readers and viewers, or can we problematize or push a little bit on this?
Yeah. Well, you've just dangled some raw meat in front of me, because satisfaction is one of the things I'm really interested in. It's actually a term that comes up a lot in not just recent seriality studies, but yeah, actually, if you're interested, you can Google. It's an article I wrote called "Serials and Satisfaction." It's probably the only article I've written, the most extensive article I've written that actually tackles both TV and 19th century serials together. And just a little context, the article begins partly by quoting reviews of Middlemarch when it came out. And this phrase satisfaction comes up about whether Middlemarch is a satisfying book. And so there's a long history of that term. Obviously, the term exists outside of seriality, but I'm interested in it because satisfaction literally means enough of something, right? Status is enough, right? And whether you can have enough and then you feel like you're full, right? As part of the analogy, as a kind of a food analogy. And my argument is that, serials there's always too much, right? There's too much either appetizing, like fan fiction, right? And also the longer a serial goes, the more materials, the more things it creates, and that's part of its pleasure, right? At the different directions it goes. And of course it can tie things up, but tying things up to some degree narratively doesn't necessarily tie up all the different directions or interests that it's raised. And so I'm interested in it because it is a kind of default term that, it comes up over and over again. You mentioned, when they announced the final 2 seasons of Breaking Bad were going to happen, and Vince Gilligan, the creator, says we can satisfy our viewers. And so I'm not saying that Vince Gilligan is wrong to try to do this, but I think what's interesting about it is that it does create a potential dichotomy between satisfying or not. Is that there's something that's contained, and part of my interest in seriality is that this is not, I mentioned I was Aristotelian before, and I'm going to critique Aristotle, not so much a critique of him, but the way that Aristotle is a sort of foundation for the poetics, foundation for narrative theory. There is a kind of implication of containment there, right? He's writing really about tragedy, which is something that happens in front of you, right? And also these kind of unities, not all originally Aristotelian, but one day, these kind of things. There's something about the contained thing, and whether that's the play or, one of the kind of central objects, if you want to call it that, of narrative study has always been the short story or the folk tale, right? Something that's sort of contained that you wrap your head around, or maybe the Jane Austen novel. Jane Austen, someone's written a lot about, again, 3 volumes, but still not serialized. And those are all great, right? But something about seriality, both its spread, but also, again, the gap is so important to me. The question is, what is seriality? One way I've defined it, this is not entirely original, but there's the new, the old, and the gap, right? You get a new installment, right? And then that becomes old, right? And part of the way we negotiate each installment is, okay, this is something new, but how do I fit into what's happened before? But the gap is crucial. And I think that gap creates both, an opportunity, a desire for satisfaction, but that next installment may satisfy some things, right? And this is a classic technique of storytelling, where you satisfy some things and then create new appetites, right? So that's on the level of what happens in the story world, and that's important too. But it's also on the level of the more you produce, right, the more you can't satisfy. And that's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the thing that's interesting about serials, is that whether it's characters who don't get their full treatment, or just the fact that, there's another way of thinking about seriality is what's sometimes called open and closed serials. So open serials are just closed serials that could, like a soap opera or comic strips, right? Or certain kind of radio dramas that have no ending. They can go on forever, right, until they stop. As opposed to closed serials that advertise some kind of shape, whether it's, again, a Victorian novel or TV, season. But serials are always sort of negotiating between those two, right? In the sense that all serials, even if they're closed, there's a kind of openness. You enter into it, and it could go on for a while, right? But it sort of stops because of that's that's the narrative shape, right, that the writers want or the TV series wants. But part of the pleasure of entering a serial world is the sense of this could go on, right, whether that's designed or not. And likewise, even though soap operas or comic strips may not have destination points, arguably each episode is an ending, right? I mean, one of the things I argue is that, ending is in some ways a long ways off, but it's always there, whether it's a commercial break or an episode break, right? So the sense of what do we mean by an ending? What do we mean by destination point? And these are questions that are incredibly interesting and vital in seriality, and they're also answered differently by every serial. I think it's one of the interesting challenges of writing about serials. As you mentioned, I am interested in thinking about seriality across texts. I'm also constantly wondering about that, right? I mean, I think it's a healthy skepticism to say, like, well, just because, again, a telenovela, a 19th century novel, whatever it is, a podcast are serialized, right? Because they appear in installments. How much can we be confident about connecting them? And I think I'm not saying we shouldn't, right? But I think the question of both what's individual about individual serials, what's individual about different media, is really important to keep in mind. But then, allowing for that to think about what are these basic questions about the gap, these questions about, open and close, these questions about audience, right? Some of these things, it can be exciting to think about these together because sometimes you get, these things can shed light on each other in a way that if you're only thinking about one era or one medium, you don't necessarily see.
What, so, we've talked about late 19th century. We've talked to literature, alphabetic, seriality, and the different conditions and the different ways that creators were working within these constraints. Why poetry?
Right. So I think one of the interesting things for me is that some of the things we think of as we critique or see as failures in television in particular are the bedrock of poetry, by which we could think of sort of formula, if you want to think about that, right? And this goes back to, one of the things I've actually written about a little bit about is, the Odyssey and whatever, the way that poetry there in an epic sense, and there's obviously interesting connection between epic and narrative and seriality in terms of scope, but the way that I was actually, before I was anything else in college, I was a classics major, so I did a fair amount of translating of Latin and Greek poetry, and the way that a line of Greek iambic dactylic hexameter works is that each line has a certain boundaries at which you can operate, but there's also flexibility within those boundaries, right? And you also have things like in Homer, things like rosy-fingered dawn, or these sort of epithets, which are there, we think partly to help fill in the line of poetry for the poet, the epic poet, right? They have these sort of things you stick in. And there are other things about epic that is relevant as well about seriality, because there's no way the Odyssey could have been performed in one night, so it would have been a serial experience. So that's a broader context, but the sense of formula, right? Formula is how poetry operates. And again, there's free verse, but for the history of most poetry, there's some sense of either what a line of poetry looks like or what a sort of poem looks like, right? And that sense of what poetry is often, right, is some interplay between the demands of a particular poetic form or just the sense of the rhythm of how speech works and how that, the rhythm is how words sound, and meter is this kind of really sometimes arbitrary, thing that you impose on it. I think it's another thing that I inherit from the sports, right? Sports is full of all these arbitrary rules about like how long a field is or how many innings there are. And these are kind of, restrictions that could be anything else. Once you have these restrictions, and there's sort of literally a play within those, right, in sports. And I think similarly in poetry. And it just occurred to me that, formula and, repetition, and convention, right? These are things that can seem pejorative in a televisual context, right? But they're the kind of lifeblood in a very different way of poetry. And it just struck me was interesting to me about some of the shows that I started writing about. I mean, the first shows I started writing about 15 years ago were Deadwood. And it's not incidentally made by someone who was David Milch, a literature scholar who was very much interested in thinking about, partly within the story world context, but also thinking about the rhythms of literature, or the rhythms of that, which are partly about, right, the sense of rules and then playing within that. But Deadwood and Sopranos and other shows like that are sort of not abandoning, right, what we want to think of as the formulas of television in terms of, there are certain conventions about a TV episode, at least American television. There's like 3 storylines, right? There's a certain length of what's called a beat, right? A beat lasts a minute to 2 minutes, depending. You things called like the cold open, which is just the beginning thing before the credits. Some shows have. So they're only sort of, if you want to call them just poetic or prosodic markers that are just like devices that are used, right? And what was interesting with some of these shows is that they were like, to me, some interesting, like to the poetry that I find most interesting is the poetry that reveals its shape or reveals the rules, whether it's a sonnet or something else that you recognize. But then the pleasure or the interest in reading it is what is the conversation, right, between what the confinement, right, and then the play within that. And a lot of these shows that I started writing about the episodes were not 5 hours long, right? They're an hour long. They have multiple, there are a lot of things about them are recognizable by televisual context, but they're doing different things with that in terms of story, in terms of, perspective. And so my analogy had to do with the sense of thinking about, again, things that narrative theory is interested in as well, or just narratives interested as well. Like, what are the building blocks if you go back to, prop and so forth, right? What are the kind of recurring things that we get? And, the lifeblood of poetry has always been that. I mean, most of its history. Again, I think the poet I talk about that I find kind of as a model for this, I mean, model is the wrong word, is someone like Frost. Or Dickinson would also be a parallel. So, I mean, if you read a Dickinson poem, people know that she's using this sort of ballad stanza, right? So it's very recognizable. She's adopting, right, a very sort of often, not always, but this sort of fixed form, and then she's doing her own stuff with it. If you read Dickinson, she's really going off. But it's recognizable within that shape. Frost, who works on the sonnet, but he'll have a sonnet that has no rhyme. He'll have a sonnet that has an extra line. He'll have a sonnet that has couplets. These are all rule breaking, right? But they're also sonnets at the same time. And I think that sense of the visibility and resistance to structures, right, as part of where the interest in the art object comes from. I saw a lot of this happening both on the episode level and on the season level. And that was part of my interest in the season, is that it's been around for many years in lots of different ways in American television, but because of production schedules and because of people couldn't watch them independently until the 21st century, you couldn't really get a whole season. We don't really become aware of it as a kind of potential independent form. And so until the 21st century, I became interested in how the season becomes this shape, right? Especially the 13 episode season, which is not longer the dominant one, but became one for 2000, 2010 anyway. And sometimes arbitrarily, just like a lot of things, like why 13 episodes? There are some reasons behind that, but at a certain point, it just became the art form of the moment, right? And people thought, well, let's work within that, right, and see what we can do with it. And what was interesting to me is that all these shows are, bound by 13 episodes, but they're so different from each other. I mean, Deadwood and Breaking Bad and The Wire, I mean, 6 Feet Under, these are radically different shows in many ways, not just in terms of story world, but in terms of how they're using their experiments with narrative. But they're also experiments that you can also line up because they are, choosing certain kinds of restrictions, right? The 13 episodes or whatever, as, challenges, if you want to call them that, right? Or, you think about, comics, again, the frame, right? These things that exist. And then a comic can work with the frame or not work with the frame, or you can have a splash page, whatever, the same things that we see in comics, which I don't know nearly as well as you do, but some of that same question of there are these rules. And then part of the interest for us, but also the interest for creators, is in that interplay between, the rules and then the freedom,
It's interesting that someone like Mike Leigh, who is well known for not preordaining or constraining through like a written script, became the focus of a book-length study, which of course requires a lot of time, investment, and passion, and even involvement in this case with the director. So why Mike Leigh for you, Sean?
Right. Yeah, I think to be honest, it's partly, I'd say it's a separate part of my brain rather than the serial part, but I think there's a couple of, it's related in a way, but there are two answers to that question. One answer is on a practical level. There's another British filmmaker named Peter Greenaway. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but actually when I was at Bristol, I did a thesis on him, and he's about as different from Mike Leigh as you can imagine as a filmmaker. And I had the opportunity to write a book for the series from the University of Illinois Press on contemporary film directors. I said, well, I could either do a book on Mike Leigh, who I'm interested in, but I hadn't read about, or Peter Greenaway. And they basically said, well, they prefer Mike Leigh for whatever reason. So partly is an accident of public, but I've always been interested in him. I taught him, I hadn't written about him. And what interests me about his work, and it's a bit, there has some analogies, I guess, not so much to the serial form, but to this issue of this tension between, if you want to call it that, something raw and something cooked. I don't know, there are different ways of thinking about it. But, his works are roughly put into the category of realism. This is something I've always been interested in. In some ways, in cinema, I'm interested in maybe two extremes: sort of realist filmmaking, which is a set of codes and practices having to do with camera work, and also what kind of story you're telling, and certain kinds of aesthetic practices. And then I'm also interested, on the other hand, on really formally self-conscious work, right? These are often thought of as really different from each other for good reasons, right? And my interest in Leigh was not so much that he was secretly, David Lynch or Wes Anderson or somebody whose formal preoccupations are immediately visible, but that he had everything been talked about him as if he were just sort of turning the camera on like a security camera, things were happening in front of him, right? And as you said, there's something unique about his process, which is that he typically doesn't begin with any story at all. He has something in the back of his mind. He gets actors together, and maybe or rehearsal or just this sort of long period where they're sort of finding their characters, right? So that's a fascinating aspect of his work. And I think that fascination of that aspect, which seems to be organic, all these sort of terms that get used about it, is incredibly rich. But it's that sort of backstory, if you want to call it that, had sort of overwhelmed the writing about him to the degree that as if nobody thought about that he had a camera, that he knew how to use a camera, right? Or that he was thinking about style, he was thinking about narrative structure, right? And so my interest was in thinking about, yes, I wasn't trying to turn him into, someone who's a pure formalist, but there were these kind of ways he was of seeing and ways of thinking and ways of storytelling that were recurrent across his films, or at least a number of cases, that were about questions of style and questions of, form, things that are that, and the interplay, again, if the interplay in some of these sort of Frost sonnets between, the voice of as it is, the perspective as it is, the individual story, and then the rules, right, of the sonnet. With him, again, it wasn't exactly the analogy, but it was similar in that, hey, he does have these visual interests, and he does have these sort of storytelling narrative claims. There's a kind of, there's a kind of practicing theory of storytelling that's going on in these films if you start thinking about them not simply as sort of undigested events, and start thinking about them. And he does, he says himself, look, everything that you see, I've thought about very carefully and put together. As much as the story and the dialogue, all this is coming from a shared partnership with the actors. And he says there's never any improvisation or hardly any on camera. By the time you get to the camera, the shooting, he knows what he wants. The actors know what they want as well. But there's a sense of it being shaped and formed. And part of that, again, comes from this sort of discovery process. But part of it does come from certain set of interests, visual interests, narrative, preoccupations, recurrent. I've talked a lot about, he uses these recurring shots of these sort of two people in the same image. They're both looking at the camera, and there's often something about, it may just seem like just two people talking, and that is often the case, but it's often a way they're just sort of that's articulating just through their presence and through the way they're framed, two very different ways of thinking, two very different ways of imagining the world. And so I was really fascinated, to me, to think about the interplay of what is formal and what is realist, if you want to call it that. And I think all realist filmmaking opens that up, but I think his films in particular are rich in that regard. And as you say, I had the opportunity to talk to him many times, and I think he's a great interlocutor because he doesn't stand for bullshit. If he thinks a question is stupid, he'll say that. But I think he did appreciate, he said this to me, that someone was thinking about his work in a way people hadn't done before. And it wasn't his job to articulate that. But I think the fact that he cares a lot about, camera lenses, right? And thinks a lot about, these kind of things that, of course, all filmmakers think about, but that often gets erased when we think about, these films as being slices of life, which of course they are, right? But they're not, they are works of art at the same time, right?
Yeah,
and how that, yeah.
Thanks, Sean.
Sure.
No, absolutely. My huge hat off to him and to you for doing the work. So in a way, I'm kind of been hearing this all along, but what is the alpha to omega for you? Like, what do you want to be, in a way, remembered for doing as a scholar? The Sean O'Sullivan, gift to the world.
Wow, that's a little daunting. I think part of my part of the reason I'm interested in Serial is I think of myself. Well, it's not quite what Manny Farber, famous film critic, talked about termites and elephants, right? In terms of different kinds of art. And I think I see myself more as a termite in the sense of, like, I'm interested in lots of different things and sort of working at them. I'm not sure if I have a big, obviously the things I'm interested in, right? Seriality, I'm interested in things about form, and aesthetics, and those are things that I've always been interested in. but those are practices, right, or approaches rather than a theory or a school. And I think that's just the way my mind works. I don't necessarily think, not that I'm not theoretical, but I think I get to the theory through the thing, right? And that's sort of my interest in it rather than necessarily the other way around. And that's, just a way different. I guess if I had, I don't know, I think about a legacy. I can sort of talk about this. One way to answer this question is this book I'm working on, which is thinking about the season as the sort of narrative unit. And especially the first 15 years in particular of this millennium. And I think the legacy of that is that it's both thinking about thinking little and large at the same time, right? And thinking about how do specific choices matter, but how the specific choices represent echoes. The fractal is a kind of metaphor I like. They're both individual choices, but there are also choices that speak to choices on an episode level and on a kind of season level. How do these different shapes, right, or forms, right, matter to us? And I think that's one thing that I don't think I call it a legacy, but I like to bring up in my teaching that I think when my teaching works, that is helpful for students who sometimes just, get into the guts of something, which is great, and they haven't necessarily thought about, right, how it's put together, right? And I don't want them to think not about what it is, but to always just ask questions about how does this form matter, right? How does it matter that even if it's a film, is it's, widescreen or not, right? Again, none of these one things by themselves denote anything, but to always think about the shape of something, whether it's literally the shape of something. And I guess to think about, to be willing to be, I guess the term I think, again, to be willing to be diffuse, which doesn't sound very useful in your thinking, that is to be able to connect things that might otherwise seem unconnectable. I think that's maybe a kind of, again, it's not something that I set out to do, but it's the way I think. And I think the work that I often find interesting, even if it's really different from my own, is work that makes me think about things that haven't been juxtaposed, right, necessarily together. So I guess it's more about how you think about things rather than any kind of like, it's not like always a star size, like Jameson or something like that. It's not something I can necessarily, other, which is nothing wrong with that, right? Or other kinds of ways of thinking that become, systematic, programmatic. I think of myself as someone who is asking, always curious and asking questions about, what the textual and just, and just the sensual, physical quality of an object. How does it work? Again, I have a bit of an art history background as well. How does that matter to how we respond to it? So that's not really an answer to your question at all.
That's just great. Actually,
I think
it leads me right into your classroom. Okay. So Sean, how do you get, or what's the elevator kind of pitch version of a Sean O'Sullivan way method to get students to think about that kind of textuality or form and how it matters? Yeah.
I think if someone takes the stairs rather than elevators. I'm not sure I have an elevator pitch, but I should have one. That's part of my. I think one answer to that question is, what's one way I thought about it? Sort of, first of all, it depends on the class, right? But I think of it as more as sort of things to drop in. I feel like obviously there's certain contexts like a narrative theory class, but I still feel as if the best way is to say, well, here's one tool or one way of thinking, right? Whether it's, again, a gap, right? Which is an interesting term because, of course, that's, one thing I talk about when I teach narrative theory is that the word gap, right, does actually appear in narrative theory, but it's thinking more about gap filling within a text, right? One of the things I sort of try to talk about when I talk about seriality is like, well, a lot of narrative theory texts talk about, say, Dickens and Eliot, right? But traditionally, they don't talk about them as serial objects, right? But they think about gaps, but not necessarily gaps in production. And so it's sort of thinking about, okay, what ways of, what things does this text seem to ask us to look at, right? Pay attention to. And so I will introduce terms, not necessarily because I want them to, depends on the class, because I want them to have a comprehensive knowledge of all the vocabulary of narrative theory. I think we often get to that, right? But it's more like, I don't know if there's an example or not, but one book I've taught a couple of times recently is Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies, right? Which is a short story collection. Part of the reason I teach it, there are certain parallels to the short story collection as a kind of form, right? Especially the kind of thematic, but short story collection with different characters and different, take place at different places. There are some places in common. but it's sort of talking about questions of, here's a story that's focalized through person X, right? And, and by having a kind of a collection of things, right, you can ask those kind of questions, or you can ask questions about, or just what kind of narrative shape something has. We talk about the story, we talk about the collection, right? How do we, and I asked, one of the exercises I give them is like, what if we rearrange the stories in the collection? How would that matter to how we think about it? So trying to take, again, maybe going back to sort of taking the object and sort of turning it inside out, right, and asking questions of how it's working. So using terms, again, like gap filling or focalization, or I'm trying to think of other ones possibly that are relevant. Obviously narration, right? I mean, homodiegetic narrator or whatever, right? So asking things that, because it seems to me what's useful narrative theory is that it exists because narratives existed, right? And people wanted to find ways of talking about them, right? And so to think about, each time you go to a new book or film or whatever, is to be aware of what you've talked about before, but to be as open as possible to what the film is giving you, right? Or what the text is giving you and what it's not giving you, right? And it's maybe that negative space is just as important as that positive space, like, well, what's left out, right? And those are things that have to do with, again, gaps or it's a term that Porter Abbott uses. It's a slightly weird term in his book. It's called narrative jamming, he calls it. I'm not sure anybody else has picked up on that. It sounds like music, but it's about sort of where you're given one thing, but you're frustrated in some way, right? Either that through information or through why it's told a certain way. So, bringing terms in, as I feel are not like the right term to use, but are terms that the text asks for. And it's something I've always thought about, and it's something you say, that often the most interesting works of narrative theory are actual novels themselves or movies themselves. That doesn't mean narrative theory as defined isn't incredibly important, but how does this novel think about what it's telling, or what choices is it's making? And I think to use the novel or the movie or the TV show itself as a work of narrative theory, right, in conversation with narrative theory proper, in that it's, again, that's what interests me about a lot of these TV shows, is that they really do seem to be thinking about what television can be, right? What television storytelling can be, right? In a medial context, but also in a broader context, right? In the sense of, why do we tell stories, right? For whom is the story told, right? What happens if we tell a story? I mean, The Sopranos famously has an episode where these characters appear in Pine Barrens and they never come back again. What do we expect? What are the rules, right? Or what is the transaction between a creator and an audience, right? And we can ask these questions through the language of narrative theory, and that's great. But I also try to see what kinds of questions the artwork is asking of us too.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. We co-taught together. So
yes, we have.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, what's next for you? You started to get a little bit into this with your new book, but let's hear about your new book and what you're doing, Sean.
I mentioned the book, and I also could mention the totally goofy project. There's the kind of thing where I'm much more interested in the book after the book I'm working on. We all get tired of the book we're working on at a certain point. So this book project, right, is thinking about really trying to foreground the season as a form, which people talk about a lot, but there hasn't really been a book that sort of takes the new season as its sort of central focus, right? And sort of starting with Sopranos, sort of perhaps obviously, but that is the kind of what everyone feels about that show. It became a model for other shows to follow, and thinking about the season and what one reason I use the sonnet analogy, and that's the name of the book, The Sonnet Season on American Television, is that just as in a sonnet, as in other art poetic forms, there are sort of different parts of the sonnet do different kinds of things, right? And what I'm interested in thinking about is there are certain challenges at the beginning of a show or beginning of a season, right? But then one of my arguments is that fifth episodes are often really crucial turning points. Just as often that's a crucial turning point in a poem, not because people had in mind, like, let's do 4 crappy episodes and a good one, but if you're trying things out with a TV show that are different, you often may not find your language for a while, right? So I'm interested in that kind of thing. I'm interested in sort of middles of seasons, which become these places where there's a kind of perhaps lateral freedom. Jennifer Egan, who wrote A Visit from the Goon Squad, talked about how, which is again another sort of collection of short stories / novel. She talks about how, perhaps surprisingly, The Sopranos was influential to her, not because of anything in the story world, but because that sense of you can be lateral but also forward at different times, right? So I'm interested in how, in the context of a closed 13-episode thing, the ways in which people were sort of found ways of thinking about character, about space, about momentum, but also de-momentum, if you want to call it that, in different ways while still telling stories about people, right? These are not purely experimental objects, right? So that's the shape of the book, and it's using a bunch of different series, including The Sopranos, Wire, Deadwood, but also a little more, some more recent ones, including Fargo, Americans, and Orange is the New Black, and Transparent. So those are kind of, if you want to call them legacy series, right, of the teens as opposed to the zeros, and how they are rethinking this. So I'm interested in a kind of both historical scope, but also thinking about where have we gotten to, right, over the last 15 years in terms of what TV can be. And TV, some people in media studies resist this, but certainly I think a lot of creators would say that TV is in a different place now from what it was 15 years ago in terms of what it can be and what the options are. And I'm sort of working through how that became the case on a kind of, close looking storytelling level. I'll just mention this other crazy book we just have been thinking about for a very long time. It's called The Portrait and the Plot. And it's about a painter, a novelist, and a filmmaker. It's about Jacques-Louis David, the 18th century painter, Alfred Hitchcock. Charles Dickens and Alfred Hitchcock. And it's called The Portrait and the Plot. It's about these sort of moments in their careers where they're thinking about character and plot and really sort of theorizing those. And the reason I'm interested in David, he was a neoclassical painter who painted both before, during, and after the French Revolution. But he's one of the first painters, I shouldn't say this, but portrait painting and history painting have always been very different art forms in the history of painting, right? So either you were known as one, right? You did portraits, or you did like big scale biblical epics or whatever, right? And some people did both. But the part of the French Revolution did is it sort of changed our whole sense of what we mean by, right, character and plot, right? And so he's someone who does both. And what's interesting about his painting is that he sort of makes us rethink about how, if you want to call it that, right, vast narrative and the psychological interplay. One of his most famous paintings is a painting called The Death of Marat, which people may know, but it's a painting that's about a revolution, figure of a revolution after his death. And it's simultaneously a portrait and a history painting, maybe the first painting in the history that was both at the same time. And so I'm interested in how that works in painting, right? And then there's this sort of sequence of novels of Dickens, and then with Hitchcock, I'm interested in these 4 films he makes sort of late in his career, and how he uses the hotel as this, just a recurring thing in Hitchcock's career, as this place where it's both a place of psychology and a place of narrative. So I'm interested in thinking, there's no books about painting novels and films because people aren't stupid, but I'm just sort of interested in thinking, how do these questions in very different contexts, right, this historical context as well, how do these sort of really basic questions of, are you reading for character or reading for plot? Obviously, we're often reading for both, right? But these are writers or artists who are kind of wrestling with that within their own medium and within a certain context, and open up interesting questions independently of each other. So it's a kind of a 3, sequence book, but it's also a book that tries to say, not that painting and cinema and the novel are the same, but what happens when we ask these questions about. Because what's interesting about paintings is there were all these rules about, what a painting should be, right? It's a landscape, or it's a genre painting. There were these 18th century codified rules about, and we think of narratives not having that, right? And I'm interested in how that sense of what we're getting is foregrounded and then gets played with, right, in each of these cases. So I've been thinking of this book for a long time. I hope I'll eventually get to write it. I've taught these 3 people together. But I think it speaks to my kind of both either completely non-contained, non-organized way of thinking, but also my desire to bring different media and different eras together through narrative.
The title of that book, or tentative title anyway, maybe, sounds very much like a Peter Greenaway film.
Portrait and the Plot. That's funny.
I just hope there's no cannibalism, or maybe there will be. Who knows? But Sean, you've taken us from Homer through Dickens, George Eliot, Mike Leigh, The Sopranos, Deadwood, really helping me and the viewers see how important form is, how form can lead to spaces of dissatisfaction or right narrative jamming, and why it finally matters. So thank you, Sean.
My pleasure.